Good evening. Happy to have Dr. Shashi Tharoor to inaugurate the 46th anniversary celebrations of DC Books and to speak on India-China relations. DC Books, started in 1974 by DC Kizhakemuri, is now among the top 5 literary publishing houses of India. DC Books publishes more than 1,500 books a year, which includes 600 new titles. Proud to say that debut works of many best-selling authors has been published by DC Books, which includes almost all the current top-selling authors of Malayalam. DC Books publishes the highest number of translated works into any language in India. Glad that we have published Shashi Tharoor in as early as 1998, while he was with United Nations and not a regular feature in the Indian media at that time. Shashi, we have a picture of you for the release of the India Midnight to Millennium in Malayalam in 1998. Let me share it.
That was several kilos ago, Ravi.
I know, it's about 21 years ago.
Look at you on the side there.
I'm sorry, yeah, I am. That's
wonderful seeing your late father. Great.
Shashi, happy and grateful to welcome a well-wisher and a good friend, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, for inaugurating the 46th anniversary celebrations and to speak on the India-China relations, which is one of the most relevant topics of the times. Shashi Tharoor, a seasoned, thorough diplomat, politician, student of international relations, former Minister for Foreign Affairs. Let me welcome Shashi Tharoor once again to the crowd.
Thank you very much, Ravi.
Malayalam translation of Shashi's work has been probably the first translation to any language in India of his works. Post this, actually, in the next coming days, we have Jairam Ramesh speaking on the environment impact assessment on Friday, and Dr. Kapil Sibil speaking on the national education policy on Saturday. Actually, let me welcome all of you to the India-China relations talk by Shashi Tharoor and to the 46th anniversary celebrations. Thank you, Shashi, once again, and welcome.
Thank you. Is the floor mine? Shall I start?
It's all yours. I mean, it's because you do actually start those.
Yes, thank you very much, Ravi, and I want to thank you for inviting me to deliver the DC Kizhakemuri Memorial Oration. Apart from celebrating the 46th anniversary of DC Books, who are my principal publishers in Kerala and who have brought out more than a dozen of my books in Malayalam. I have very fond memories of your father because he was indeed, as you rightly pointed out, the first person to publish a Malayalam translation of one of my books, in this case, India from Midnight to the Millennium, or as he chose to title it, India Ardharatri Mudal Aranutanda. And that book, when it came out, started off, or was kicked off with a wonderful event in Kottayam, which is where the picture you showed the audience came from. As I said, I was, shall we say, several kilos lighter in those days, and your late father was a picture of health. I'm so sorry that he's no longer with us, but I want to congratulate you publicly, Ravi, for all that you have done to continue his wonderful literary traditions and to build on them to make DC Books such an incredibly important voice, as well as platform for writing, for literature, and for the sales of books throughout Kerala and by extension. You've invited me to not just join in celebrating what DC Books is doing, but to address the question of India-China relations. And as you suggested, I'll try and do justice to this very vast theme in about half an hour so we can take a few questions before I have to leave you at 6:30. I want to say that as India and China settle in for a prolonged standoff on our tense Himalayan border, it is really time to take the longer view. Has the clash in Ladakh's Galwan Valley in June, which claimed the lives of 20 Indian Jawans and an unknown number of Chinese troops, actually brought into the open something far bigger and more momentous, a gradual strategic shift in the geopolitics of Asia with implications for the rest of the world? On the face of it, the suggestion seems exaggerated. After all, the two countries have been making a decent fist of living with each other, despite our failure to achieve a durable settlement of our disputed 3,500-kilometer border, the Line of Actual Control, or LAC, established at the end of a short but bloody war in 1962, which humiliatingly left China in possession of 23,200 square kilometers of Indian territory. At the same time, Beijing regularly reminds India that it still claims a further 92,000 square kilometers, mainly in the northeastern Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, which it calls South Tibet. Despite this, for decades, the situation had not been allowed to get out of control. Whenever troops from either side build highways, construct or repair roads, bunkers, and other routine fortifications, or conduct patrols close to the LAC, tensions can and repeatedly do flare up, but these have always been diffused. Both governments tend to downplay troop movements of the other side as resulting from differing perceptions of where the LAC, which has never been officially demarcated, lies. In addition to several hundred local face-offs, there have been major Chinese transgressions in Depsang, 2013, Chumar, 2014, and a 73-day standoff at Doklam in Bhutan, 2017, which required high-level diplomatic and military engagement to defuse. This time, in April and May, there were multiple Chinese intrusions across the LAC, simultaneously at the Galwan Valley, Hot Springs, Pangong So in eastern Ladakh, Naku La in North Sikkim, and the same outcome was expected. Not a shot had been fired in anger across the LAC in 45 years. The loss of life this time shatters nearly half a century of peace. Now, the fatal incident has, of course, provoked fury and hostility across Indian public opinion. We've seen the burning of effigies of President Xi Jinping, the smashing of Chinese-made TV sets by emotional owners, widespread calls to boycott Chinese goods, and even Chinese restaurants. Seen from New Delhi, India-China relations are at their lowest ebb in living memory. Now, to be sure, there were political tensions both over each country's territorial claims, over land control by the other, and over such long-term problems as China's all-weather alliance with India's hostile separated sibling Pakistan, and India's hospitality to the Dalai Lama, to whom we granted refuge when he fled Tibet in 1959. But neither country had allowed these tensions to overwhelm them. China had declared that the border dispute could be left to future generations to resolve, and India had endorsed the One China policy, refusing to support Tibetan secessionism while limiting official reverence for the Dalai Lama to his status as a spiritual leader. India has basically shown no desire to rock the boat. Its actions and statements have always been designed not to provoke its northern neighbor, but to relegate the border problem to the back burner while enabling trade relations with China, now worth close to $100 billion, to flourish. India made it clear that it was unwilling to join in any US-led containment strategy of its bigger northern neighbor. Its traditional obsession with preserving its strategic autonomy after 2 centuries of colonial rule made it wary of the blandishments of the West. Ironically, 2020 was supposed to be a landmark year for the two countries' bilateral relations. In October 2019, at their 18th meeting in the last 9 years, this time in the Southeast Indian resort town of Mahabalipuram, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi had grandly pledged to take relations between their two countries to greater heights. To mark the 70th anniversary of formal diplomatic relations between the two countries, they announced they would conduct 70 joint activities, including further improving their burgeoning trade, supporting scholarly research into their ancient civilizational links, and even exchanging military delegations in a grand show of Sino-Indian cooperation. This wasn't just fluff. The two countries had indeed developed multiple avenues of engagement. From negligible levels till 1991, trade with China had grown to become India's second largest trading relationship. Prime Minister Modi, an early enthusiast, had lifted residual restrictions on bilateral Chinese investment in strategic sectors of the Indian economy, notably ports, airports, power generation, and telecoms technology, so that by 2020, Chinese investment, current and planned, stood at about $26 billion, with infrastructure projects accounting for about half the total. However, that figure may be reduced after the Indian government in August barred Chinese companies from government road projects. India is an enthusiastic partner in the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and engages with China diplomatically in the BRICS, an association of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as well as conducting annual summits of RIC, Russia, India, China. It's an equal partner with China in the multilateral BRICS New Development Bank, headquartered in Shanghai with an Indian chief executive. But it's become increasingly apparent that this policy of sidestepping contentious issues and encouraging bilateral economic relations has played into Chinese hands. The PLA has used the seemingly benign situation to repeatedly undertake minor military incursions, inflict small-scale military setbacks on India, take a few square kilometers of territory along the LAC for local tactical purposes, and then declare peace. Mutual disengagements are duly announced. Both sides claim the crisis is over, but China establishes and fortifies its new development. These mini-crises always end with the Chinese in a better position on the ground than ever before. Each incident establishes a new normal on the LAC. In the recent face-off, the Chinese troops seem to have been engaged in a tactical move to advance their positions along areas of the LAC that it covets in order to threaten Indian positions and interdict our patrols. After the recent incursions, the Chinese now control over 900 square kilometers of area in Ladakh along the LAC that they didn't control in April of this year. They seem to be eyeing our construction of roads, bridges, and similar infrastructure on undisputed Indian territory, a belated effort to mirror similar Chinese efforts near the LAC in Tibet. Rather than merely patrolling, they have established a fixed presence in these areas well beyond China's own claim line, occupied the Finger Heights near Pangong So, which is a lake, pitched hundreds of tents, constructed concrete structures, and built additional kilometers of road along the LAC. The objective seems to be to extend Chinese troop presence to the intersection of the Galwan River and the Shyok River, which would make the Galwan Valley off bounds to India. The Chinese have constructed permanent structures in their area of intrusion and issued statements claiming that sovereignty over the Galwan Valley has always belonged to China. China's strategy seems to be to consolidate the LAC where it wants it, so that an eventual border settlement that takes these new realities into account will be in its favor. That's the long-term plan. Beijing keeps saying the border should be left to future generations to settle, knowing full well that each passing year increases China's relative military, economic, and geopolitical strength vis-a-vis India, while shifting the LAC in its favor. In the meantime, border incidents keep us off balance and demonstrate to the world that India is not capable of challenging China, let alone offering security to other nations. Whereas Deng Xiaoping had told then Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1988 that the 21st century would be India and China's century, the current Chinese leadership has no patience for such pablum. They believe, indeed they know that it's destined to be China's century alone, and are all happy to show India its subsidiary place in the pecking order. India's tactical options are unenviable. It has reinforced its military assets on the LAC to prevent deeper incursions for now, and hopes to press the Chinese to restore the status quo ante through either diplomatic or military means. Chinese and Indian officials have been currently engaged in diplomatic and military-to-military dialogue to ease tensions, but de-escalation has been stalled for months, with China behaving as if their disengagement is already complete. India needs either to convince China to remove its troops from various sectors across the LAC that they have transgressed since May 2020, or to dislodge the People's Liberation Army forces militarily from the areas it disputes. The military option, of course, could involve capturing land elsewhere on the LAC to swap for this purpose. And this may be why we heard of some incidents in the last weekend of August. But this, in any case, is all easier said than done. India has seemed to be trusting a negotiating process that has bought the Chinese time to entrench themselves in positions they had never held before. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Modi's astonishing statement made for home consumption to protect his assiduously cultivated domestic image as an unbending man of iron, that neither has anyone intruded across our border nor is anyone intruding into Indian territory, looks suspiciously like a surrender to the new reality in the Galwan Valley and Pangong Tso Lake, where the Chinese have undeniably established positions that did not exist before May. Aside from looking like an admission of weakness, this may further embolden China, convincing the PLA it can pursue small local gains across the LAC with impunity. Mr. Modi has developed a reputation in India for being able to spin any setback as a personal triumph. But the same technique is counterproductive when deployed internationally. Smart tacticians in Beijing could realize that they can take anything from this Indian government so long as Mr. Modi is allowed a PR victory. The Chinese have indeed been quick to cite the Indian PM's words as absolving them of any wrongdoing. Now, frustrations are mounting. India's Foreign Minister Jaishankar reportedly told his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi that this unprecedented development will have a serious impact on the bilateral relationship. Since then, Indians have bluntly conveyed that it would be ridiculous to expect no economic or other consequences. The government has moved in a largely symbolic act of economic retaliation, banning 59 Chinese apps in India on grounds of data security, and then adding another 100 to the mix. One of them, TikTok, had such a thriving following in India that its banning is estimated to have cost its parent company, ByteDance, some $6 billion. It's likely that Chinese companies may soon be banned from various lucrative opportunities in the vast Indian market. Two of them, Huawei and ZTE, had been leading contenders in the ongoing 5G trials to be picked to build India's 5G telecoms infrastructure. But indications of likely changes to India's telecom sector procurement policies suggest that neither may remain in contention, though an official decision is yet to be announced. India has also reimposed tighter limits on Chinese investment in projects such as railways, motorways, public sector construction projects, and telecoms, a reversal of the openness to China that the Modi administration had initially shown. Yet India is far too dependent on China for other vital imports, such as pharmaceuticals and even the active ingredients to make them, automotive parts, microchips, all needed by Indian manufacturers. But many fear it would be shooting itself in the foot if it acted too strongly against China. Today, India's dependence on China for its non-consumption economy remains high. What is more, imports from China have become indispensable for India's exports to the rest of the world. Various manufacturing inputs, industrial equipment and components, and even some technological know-how come from China. Eliminating them could have a seriously negative effect on economic growth at a time when, thanks mainly to the COVID crisis, India's GDP is estimated to have shrunk by as much as 29% in the current fiscal year, though the problems had begun before COVID, but under this present government. Indian construction projects in the private sector, where no Indian government agency is a major player, may still go to one of the between 1,000 to 1,500 Chinese companies still operating in India on the basis of cost considerations. And there are limits to the effectiveness of any Indian retaliation. Trade with China may seem substantial to us, but it only represents 2% of China's exports, and drastically reducing it would not be enough to deter Beijing or cause it to change its behavior. Our decision to pull out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership because of concerns of Chinese dominance of that arrangement has been portrayed by the government as shielding vulnerable Indians from the depredations of foreign economic predators. But it's also a confession that our economy still suffers from structural problems that render our businesses, and most of them, unfit to compete. Other members seem to believe that India's involvement in RCEP is essential to prevent the Chinese dominance that would otherwise be sure to ensue. India should ideally keep its options open to improve cooperation with other Asian countries. But the recent border fracas seems to have only intensified New Delhi's allergy to joining a club of which China is such a significant member. So this range of considerations seems to leave only two strategic options for India: reconciling itself to playing second fiddle to an assertive China in the region, or seeking strength and leverage by aligning itself with a broader international coalition against Chinese ambitions. And the first option is unviable in a democracy. With the government already under fire in some sections of the media and from us in the opposition over its limp response, India has no choice but to insist upon the restoration of the status quo ante and a return to positions occupied before April 2020. New Delhi knows this is a test of its resolve. Giving into Chinese tactics would invite more salami slicing by the PLA. The deaths of unarmed soldiers in a physical brawl was a humiliation that Mr. Modi cannot easily live down. In any case, it's very much in New Delhi's interest to prove to all watchers, including China's ally Pakistan, that it's no pushover. Otherwise, things will get worse on other fronts. Pakistan has already intensified its sponsorship of militancy in Kashmir. It's far from clear, however, that China will oblige with a unilateral withdrawal. In 2020, the region has been seeing a stronger, more assertive China, keen on demonstrating its weight in the world amid talk of post-COVID decoupling. After first being pushed on the defensive by international opprobrium for having incubated the coronavirus, it quickly moved from shoring up its image to asserting itself through aggressive wolf warrior diplomatic and military moves. Wolf Warrior was a Chinese film that seems to depict this new aggressive mood in the country. It's tightened its grip over Hong Kong, increased tensions in the neighborhood by increasing maritime patrols near the Japanese Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, sending vessels off the coasts of Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, redoubled its extensive claims in the South China Sea, conducted aerial reconnaissance near Taiwan, unleashed trade sanctions and economic pressure on Australia, imposing 80% tariffs on Australian barley, conducting cyber attacks against Australian government servers, deployed military force in its border dispute with Bhutan, cracked down on the Muslim Uyghur minority in the western province of Xinjiang. All of this essentially suggests a newly resurgent, indeed brazen China, which has no interest in ending the India crisis. And with both countries sending reinforcements to the border, a prolonged military standoff seems likely. The crisis has also strengthened the constituency in New Delhi for the second option, advocated by those who feel India should now make common cause with the US and other democracies to ward off the threat from China. China, the argument runs, must be curbed, and we can't do it alone. Why not join up with the US and, of course, its friends? Well, this would mark a major departure from India's traditional reluctance to compromise its hallowed strategic autonomy. True, New Delhi has already been moving closer to the United States, coordinating with Washington and the Financial Action Task Force, which sanctions support for terrorism, the UN Security Council, and the World Intellectual Property Organization. Indo-US military cooperation took a quantum leap with a logistics support agreement in 2016, a communication security agreement in 2018, an accord on geospatial cooperation. India has also endorsed the US concept of the Indo-Pacific region. It's been gradually shaking off its formerly tentative embrace of the US-led Quad, deepening its strategic ties with Australia and Japan, and going ahead with a foreign ministers meeting of the quadrilateral group after years of not letting it rise to that level. And a second such meeting is supposed to be imminent. So it suggests that the foundations have been laid for a more substantive strategic shift. Some clues to new thinking in Delhi have emerged from the recent publication of a book by Jayashankar called The India Way, where he says openly that the challenge India faces is to manage a more powerful neighbor while ensuring its own rise, and that the search for equilibrium must continue. As a former ambassador to Beijing himself, he admits that the initial advocacy of free trade with China has given way to strong resentment at its one-sidedness. Our bilateral trade deficit is $55 billion. And also, of course, that the cheap import of manufactured goods has been wiping out our industrial base. So he says that don't take it as for granted that the economic collaboration is a foregone conclusion. because there's been no reciprocity. And therefore, an active economic decoupling from China seems to me on the cards. And after COVID, everyone's exploring different trustworthy global supply chains untied to China. Similarly, of course, the foreign minister says that India is comfortable with the connectivity contributions of some Chinese-led institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the BRICS New Development Bank, but not happy with Beijing's unilateral enterprises like the Belt and Road Forum, which we refuse to attend, being the only major country not to attend, partially because the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor violates our sovereignty by running through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, but also because we publicly flagged Belt and Road's lack of openness, transparency, and international norms. Our feelings have become much more negative now after the recent incidents. There are obvious incentives to double down on hostility to China, therefore. They're being belligerent on the LAC. They've deepened support for Pakistan. They've sunk $60 billion into the CPEC, which is running through Pakistan to the Pakistani port of Gwadar on the edge of the Gulf. And then, of course, there's no question that a peace strategy with these two adversaries is not particularly favored by the BJP anyway, because the BJP government that has stripped J&K of autonomy in an open challenge to Pakistan. And of course, let's remember that there is a different challenge, which is that China has encouraged armed and financed insurgencies in India's northeast in the 70s and 80s, and it could easily do the same again if relations with India continue to be strained. China has also seemed intent on encircling India strategically and economically by setting up ports and naval bases that have been described as a string of pearls around India's neck, as well as by developing economic corridors that circumscribe it. CPEC, but also other corridors like BCIM, Bangladesh, China, and Myanmar are involved, the Trans-Himalayan Connectivity Network. And we've seen a Chinese hand in some of the Indian government's difficulties with other neighbors, especially in Nepal. Its communist government has been emboldened to question its own border with India. Sri Lanka, where China is developing a port and an airport in the Sri Lankan Prime Minister's constituency, Hambantota. China's opposition to India's international aspirations to a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, its blocking of Indian membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, and its continued claims to Arunachal Pradesh. So all of this suggests that they are trying to be quite difficult with us. And many strategists are saying, why can't India contemplate a riposte as well? We all know that the BJP doesn't mind abandoning established policy. They got two BJP MPs to thumb their noses at Beijing by attending the virtual swearing-in ceremony of Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, in May. Other indications of a strategic turn away from China include India's support for the US position on the Indo-Pacific region in general, the South China Sea in particular, and of course I've mentioned our opposition to BRI. And there are additional signs emerging, for example, our invitation to Australia to participate in the annual Malabar naval exercise with the Indian, Japanese, and American navies seems to be on the card later this year. And there's other agreements developing with Australia and Japan, including possibly an intelligence sharing through the so-called Five Eyes Alliance. So there's certainly a number of issues that suggest that there are tremendous possibilities in this area. But there are other potential speed breakers on the road to a strategic realignment. India, a founder of the non-aligned movement during the US-Soviet Cold War, has historically been allergic to alliances, and we feel no desire to put our strategic eggs all in one basket. India is still heavily dependent on Russian military equipment and supplies, though we have diversified our purchases to include American, French, and Israeli armaments. And we will not want to jeopardize relations with Russia, which is one of the few partners that might have some influence with China. We are actually trying to include Russia in our understanding of the Indo-Pacific to show that the concept is not locked into the US-China face-off. And that, of course, we have shared interests with Russia over freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. But we may be overlooking that Moscow has already become much more dependent on Beijing than ever before. With the Russian economy shaken by Western sanctions and COVID-19, wreaking havoc. And they have compatible positions on Syria and Iran. China is helping shore up the wilting Russian economy. Russia has been helping enhance China's own military prowess. And Russia today supplies more of China's arms imports than every other source combined. China-Russia relations are far more important to Moscow than Indo-Russian ones. So I'm afraid the more strained that India's relationship with China becomes, the less likely we are to be able to find much aid and comfort from Moscow. What about the US, which Prime Minister Modi seems to see as our indispensable partner? Well, President Trump seems to have shared many of his earlier illusions about Xi's China. But but while India was squaring up to China on the LAC, the strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing has notably worsened, with rhetorical clashes intensifying on issues ranging from the origins of COVID-19 to trade imbalances and retaliatory tariffs. So with the Americans getting more and more determined to call for collective action against China, and Secretary of State Pompeo musing on whether it's time for a new grouping of like-minded nations, a new alliance of democracies, where will India stand? I think there's certainly shared mistrust of China, increasing hostility to China, but there's always some caution in New Delhi about anything like an alliance with Washington, because Donald Trump's hyper-transactional United States has never struck our foreign policy establishment as a particularly reliable partner. And therefore, we will be wary of American blandishments to join Washington in seeking the containment of China. If you have questions on this, I'll be happy to go into it in some more detail. But the fact is that there has been some caution in India's approach, in India's engagement with Washington, even while we are strengthening relations with the Quad, engaging on the so-called Quad Plus dialogue, enthusiastically welcoming President Trump's initiative to convene an expanded gathering of G7 leaders, which will include Australia, South Africa, and us, almost like a group of 10 democracies. All of this suggests increasing strategic convergence between America and India. But I would suggest that rather than go in for a containment strategy, which is what the Americans are recommending, what we should do probably is actually constraining China's assertiveness. Now, the difference between containing and constraining is not just two letters of the alphabet. A containment strategy refuses engagement and persuasion. It's a hostile policy. Constraining, on the other hand, engages with the adversary in order to restrict or limit the destabilizing aspects of its behavior. The former Australian Foreign Secretary Peter Verghese, who also originates in Kerala, he puts it well: containment seeks to thwart and weaken the PRC, constraining seeks to manage a powerful PRC. Constraining China would not involve turning the Quad into a military alliance, a sort of latter-day SEATO, because India is right to preserve its strategic autonomy by refusing to entangle itself in alliances. Rather, it's a means of China's neighbors using their diplomatic, geopolitical, and military leverage to manage Beijing's ambitions in a manner that constrains how much it can get away with. Coordinating with the Quad countries, US, Japan, India, and Australia, would maximize that leverage, because together, and especially if we expand our consultations to include countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, South Korea, which have similar concerns about China's assertiveness, we can collectively constrain China's behavior to impose costs on them. So no one wants war. Containment need not be the name of the game. We should keep all our lines of communication open to Beijing while working a constraining strategy. We should increase our trade, of course, redressing the balance, diversifying our supply chains so we're not overly dependent on a flow that can be turned off. We must continue to cooperate in regional and multilateral organizations like the UN. We also engage with China in BRIC and BRICS and G20, East Asia Summit, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, APEC, and all this should continue in both countries' interests. China should not feel that we are treating it as an enemy, despite its support for Pakistan across the board, but we should recognize the divergence of strategic fundamentals. In conclusion, let me say we must retain flexibility to align with other countries on an issue-by-issue basis as we see fit, while remaining open to partnerships and collective action, as well as strengthening our capacity to act unilaterally when we must. The US, in turn, must end its Trumpian unilateralism if it wants us to get closer to it, and we must encourage it to reinvest in international institutions, not just the expanded G7 or an emerging coalition of democracies, but also multilateral bodies such as the UN and the WHO, which are indispensable for coping with global crises, and which, by the way, China will only happily dominate if the US is absent from the fray of multilateralism. So I think with such an approach in place, India will see that it's in our interest to constrain China, to stay engaged with it, not to contain it. The illusions of the past quarter century have been shattered in the snowy heights of the Himalayas. We are not alone in the region in re-evaluating our strategic options, but we should do so in a careful and calibrated manner unless our caution is pushed to the breaking point by China. That risk remains because evolving events could yet drive a reluctant India into the US embrace. China doesn't seem to care. Beijing seems to have decided it can afford to put India in its place, even if that place is in the opposite camp. We shouldn't let them push us into it without going in with our eyes open. Thank you very much. Jai Hind. I'll be happy to take your questions for about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Shashi. Some of the questions are in the comments, actually, if you can. Mr. Govind, can you highlight it, please, the questions?
There seem to be so many, it'll take me more than the time we have available to read all of them. Let me see. Can you highlight any that you've already noticed that can be picked? Because I do have, let's see, upping the anti... China on Monday asserted it never recognized Arunachal Pradesh, says Nauman Jabbar, addressing a news conference. China's foreign minister spokesman said this, etc. Yes, Mr. Jabbar, absolutely, you are right. That is that the Chinese have consistently said they do not recognize Arunachal Pradesh as an Indian province. In fact, I used to have a private secretary when I was the foreign minister who was born in Arunachal Pradesh, and he couldn't get a visa to go to China. They said, we'll give you a passport, you're our citizen. Obviously, we had to take a very tough stand on that, but the Chinese occasionally, very reluctantly, will give a passport issued on a separate piece of paper. They've been really tough on recognizing that, and it's time, perhaps, that we showed them similar toughness on issues that matter to them, which we have not really do. So, next question. I think you did show a question on the screen.
Govind, would you highlight that? Yeah, there's one.
China manufactures things ranging from... yeah, exactly. That's precisely the point. I already said this in my speech, that China manufactures vital components that we need in India, including microchips, semiconductors, processors, and equally things that we need to manufacture for export. So that's why we would create serious problems for ourselves by just suddenly banning everything, and the Chinese realize that, which is why we are proceeding very selectively and hoping that China gets the message. But eventually, if we don't diversify supply chains, Albin John Saji, then I'm afraid we will indeed face, as you call it, a technological emergency. So that answers Naufal's question. Banning Chinese apps sends a signal. It talks about the financial, it reminds the Chinese we can hurt them financially up to a point. But as I said, we're only 2% of China's overall exports. So we're not going to be, by ourselves, able to solve any major problems just by tightening up on imports from China. Well, Xi Jinping is there at the moment for his life, unless he's overthrown in a coup. The Chinese, of course, have surprised leaders before the end of their term, and that's why they evolved a system of 10-year terms for their leaders with very orderly planned succession. And we had 3 leaders like that, including the last 2 that we've dealt with, that I've personally met. But once the last one President Hu made way and we got Xi Jinping, he started consolidating power in a very different way from his predecessors. Hu Jintao was the one I was referring to. And then Xi Jinping, normally after one 5-year term, at the start of the second 5-year term, you're supposed to name the person who will be your successor. That's how Xi Jinping was named at the start of Hu Jintao's second 5-year term. Instead, nobody was named, and his mandate has essentially been renewed indefinitely. So no one knows the answer. If you read the tea leaves coming out of China, it would be that he may continue for a very long time. He's not a very old man. He's barely in his mid-60s or early to mid-60s. He has plenty of time ahead of him in China. And I would suggest that we may have to deal with a China molded in his image, unless there is a lot of domestic discontent, of which at the moment there is no significant sign. Thank you, James KJ. Does Make in India become relevant? Yes, correct. It's a good question, because Make in India is indeed a relevant way of responding to this problem, because you do need to shorten your supply chains from China and reduce your dependence on China. But we've seen that Make in India has not made much progress in 6 years. So we cannot build castles in the air or pies in the sky. We have to solve our needs today. One last question, Rajiv Panchal. How should India balance its relations with Nepal and Bangladesh to counter China in the long term? I think that it's actually something that we should never have allowed China to take an upper hand in our own neighborhood. We don't have the kind of relations with China's immediate neighbors that they have been able to cultivate with us. Nepal is now, of course, in particular northern Nepal, an open territory for China to build roads, railways, and other encroachments. And as far as Bangladesh is concerned, it's a very delicate relationship, which unfortunately we have not always been handling very well under the present government, particularly during our domestic debates on the CAA, where the unfortunate reference to Bangladeshi migrants as termites who will be thrown out and sent back to Bangladesh created a very negative backlash, since this was a statement coming from the Home Minister of India. I think we have to be much more sensitive in the way in which we handle our neighbors if we want them to be more resistant to encroachments by by countries hostile to us, like Pakistan and China. And as far as Nepal and Bangladesh are concerned, we cannot afford to let them become hostile to Indian interests. They could do us enormous damage. Any neighboring country could become a huge thorn in our side, just as Pakistan is, including by being a very useful base for terrorists, militants, and other hostile elements to our country. So good relations with our neighbors is indispensable to us, whether it's to manage relations with China or just in our own fundamental interests at any time. Okay, Yassine Ansari, I'll take one more question, then I really have to go. I will be late for a 6:30 event. Do you think Pakistan, India, and other SAARC states will come close to each other and we'll be able to promote regional trade? South Asia, according to the World Bank, Yassine Ansari, is the least integrated region in the entire sub-region in the entire world. And part of the problem is not the part, principal source of the problem is the toxic relationship between Pakistan and India, which is why SAARC has never been really able to take off and create the kind of things that had been talked about, a SAARC free trade zone, a SAARC free media cooperation, open borders amongst our countries. And the problem is, as long as there is hostility between India and Pakistan, as long as, frankly, terrorists and militants are being sent across the border by Pakistan, as long as the two countries are in this kind of zero-sum game relationship, where now we don't even have ambassadors or high commissioners in each other's countries, I don't see this otherwise admirable goal you suggest happening. I have myself suggested, when I chaired the Foreign Affairs Committee of our Parliament, that we should actually encourage people-to-people contact, even during this period of bad relations with their military and the terrorist problem. But I think the course of relations were going along very well until the horrors of 26/11. The terrorist attacks of 26/11 has derailed any prospects of the kind of relationship that Yassine Ansari is talking about. Though attempts have been made occasionally to try and put things on an even track, sadly, they seem to have been derailed by recent events, most recently Pulwama attack last year. And I think it's fair to say that in India today, there is absolutely no appetite for improved relations with Pakistan. And by extension, this question of regional trade through open borders, roads, railways, air links, cultural links, people-to-people contacts, sporting links, bilateral test series and cricket between India and Pakistan would be a dream for all of us. But I don't think it happening. I don't see it happening until there's a fundamental shift in the diplomatic relationship between these two countries. And the rest of South Asia is bound to suffer because we are the two big players, and India alone, when you put all the South Asian countries around the table, India accounts for 70% of the combined population and 80% of the GDP. So if India won't play ball, there is no real regional progress and development. I think we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Ravi, for this opportunity to deliver this year's DC Kizhakemuri Memorial Oration. And congratulations again to DC Books on its 46th anniversary. I'm looking forward to a grand golden jubilee in 4 years' time. All the best. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Thank you. Really appreciate it. You're late for the next meeting. Thank you once again.